Hello, my name is Dr. Anastasia Jones. I am going to be presenting my dissertation research that I conducted between 2015 through 2017. And this was looking at how universities across America are responding to the NCAA policy for transgender student athletes. So it's called University Response Implementation of the NCAA Policy for Transgender Student Athletes. I also want to note that I identify as a heterosexual cisgender female. I am not speaking as someone who is a part of the LGBT community, but this was an area of research that I thought was really important to look into because I do think everybody deserves to have equal access to being able to play sports at all levels. So just a little bit of background. In 2011, the NCAA, which governs athletics for about 1,121 universities and colleges in America, clarified the rules and eligibility status for transgender athletes, as well as gave suggestions and guidelines for schools to consider or implement. This is one of the more inclusive policies that currently existed at the time. It's not the first to create a policy for transgender students or transgender student athletes, but it was one of the most inclusive. And the NCAA guidelines provides clarification on eligibility for transgender athletes using hormones, guidelines for schools and athletic departments to use to help navigate the many areas associated with playing college sports. So I think it's just important that you kind of understand it was not a mandate that schools do anything. It was just more of a guideline, a suggestion of here's what you should be considering and doing, but there was no mandates associated with this guideline that came out in 2011. So this is important because there is a growing number of people who identify as transgender. There is no true estimate that exists for the general population, but anything from 1% to 5% is what I have found. We do see that people are beginning to transition at earlier ages or are identifying earlier. People have easier access now to hormones or to surgeries to transition if they choose to do that. So what this could mean is that there could be a higher rate of people who identify as transgender who would like to be playing sports or are playing sports and who would like to be playing at who'd like to be playing throughout their life. Currently, there's a lack of information on transgender athletes in general, and then on the policies that currently are in place to support their ability to play. There's also important to realize that with this, there is some talk or concerns about what is fair in sports when we're talking about transgender athletes. That comes up a lot. And then also banned substances is another thing that's really important because if people were taking testosterone, that's a banned substance in most sports. Okay, so this slide is on the current research on medical transitioning that the NCAA based their policy off of. But again, like I said in the previous slide, fairness is something that comes up a lot when looking at transgender athletes and the policies in place, and something that has also just been in the sports world from the very beginning. In my dissertation, I talk about how even in the early Athens Olympic days, there was concerns about males and females competing against each other, and that is something that is of a lot of concern, especially if people are going to be medically transitioning or they don't want to but still want to compete with the gender that they identify with. So this research basically just kind of helps clarify at which point would a person who is assigned male at birth would no longer have an advantage over someone who was assigned female at birth or identifies as female in the sporting arena. And so what they found was they gave androgen suppression to males who were transitioning to female, and what they found was a decrease in plasma testosterone levels. It impacted their muscle mass and physical features. They found no other differences over the next 2 years. Then they had females who were transitioning to male, and they were given testosterone. And the research found that after 1 year of this, their plasma testosterone levels and muscle mass increased to a range similar to that of the males transitioning to females before the hormones. So this suggested that 1 year of cross-sex hormones is acceptable to allow a male transitioning to female to compete against or with other females. So essentially 1 year being on cross-sex hormones. So for a person assigned male at birth, that would be androgen suppression would no longer hold an advantage biologically, and that way they could compete with females or against or with them. Okay, so the two policies that would, there's two policies that would impact transgender student athlete participation. One is banned substance and one is mixed team status. So testosterone is a banned substance in pretty much any organization that governs sports. So the NCAA has said that if a student wants to begin testosterone, they would have to get a medical exemption, meaning that they would have to let their athletic trainer or team doc know that they want to start testosterone, and then you would begin the medical exemption process. If someone is using testosterone suppression medication, they can submit that documentation, and then there has to be a year of ongoing monitoring of that testosterone suppression. The other policy is mixed team status, and what that is when one individual of each gender competes on the same team, it is now considered a mixed team, and it's only eligible for men's championships. And once it's of a mixed team status, it has to stay that way for the whole year. So if a male competes on a female team, that female team is now only eligible for a men's championship. It also impacts the sports sponsorship requirements, which we won't go into, but if a female competes on a male's team, it doesn't impact the sports sponsorship at all. Okay, so this is the policy on using hormonal treatments. So if you have a transgender male, that is someone who is assigned female at birth who's transitioning to male, and they want to begin testosterone, they would have to get a medical exception before they could begin the testosterone. And to do that, they do require that you have a diagnosis of gender identity disorder or gender dysphoria. The NCAA wrote in the policy at the time transsexualism. Transsexualism is no longer in the DSM, but I wrote it as it was written at the time in the policy. So once they begin the testosterone, they are eligible to compete on a men's team immediately. If they want to continue to compete on the women's team, though, that is going to change the team status to mixed team, and then that team is only going to be eligible for men's championships. Now, if you have a transgender female, so someone who is assigned male at birth who's transitioning to female, they can begin the testosterone suppression medication. It has to be monitored for a year. They have to have the diagnosis, and then at that point, they are eligible to continue to compete on the men's team. And if they want to compete on the women's team immediately, they have to change the status to mixed team status. If they do not want to change the status, they would have to wait 1 calendar year of the testosterone suppression treatment, because that's what the research has shown at the time, that is when there's no longer like an advantage. Okay, so this is the policy on not using hormones. Not everybody who identifies as transgender is going to use hormones or seek medical means to transition, so this is why this policy exists. Any transgender student athlete who is not taking hormone treatment related to gender transition may participate in sex-separated sports activities in accordance with his or her assigned gender at birth. So a transgender male student athlete who is not taking testosterone related to gender transition may participate on a men's or women's team. A transgender female who is not taking hormone treatment as well is may not compete on a women's team, right? So if they that team would change to a mixed team status, they're still eligible to compete on a men's team. Okay, so this is my actual study now. So I did a qualitative research. I used a qualitative research design, which was used to explore how colleges and universities belonging to the NCAA were responding to or incorporating the new guidelines for transgender student athletes. At the time of my research, the policy had been out for, well, at the beginning of my research, 4 years, by the end, 6 years. So I wanted to just better understand how schools were implementing the guidelines. If not, why, what were the barriers they're facing, and just trying to currently understand what was taking place within these institutions. I do not offer any conclusive solutions because there's so limited research out there on policies for transgender student athletes. It was merely just an exploration on like what is happening, what's just going on, trying to gauge what is happening in the NCAA. Okay, so like I said, it was exploratory qualitative research design. I used open-ended questions to gather that. I did email out the survey, and most questions require the participants to type in a response. I collected information, demographic information about the schools, as well as the individual filling out the survey. I wanted athletic directors, compliance officers, and athletic trainers because I felt like those three people would most likely have the most knowledge on the policy and be most involved with any policy that was being sent out through the NCAA. I started off with 111 participants, but some people did not meet the criteria for inclusion, so they were eliminated, and then some people did not complete the survey. So at the end, I only kept 61 of the participants' information. And then I used a thematic analysis. Okay, so this was the breakdown for athletic directors or compliance officers. I combined the two because there were so few of them. The mean age was 42. The majority of the participants were female. The majority of them had been in the position for about 6 years, and the majority of the participants identified as Caucasian. So this is a breakdown for athletic trainers, which was the majority of the participants in the study. The mean age was 40. The majority of them identified as male, but I had a few people who identified as transgender and some who identified as other. Current year in that position was 13, and the majority of them identified as Caucasian. So this is the demographic on the institutions. I gathered information about region, community, surrounding divisions, and then public, private, or religious affiliation. So most of the people were from the Northeast, Northwest region of America. Majority of the participants were in urban surroundings, and the majority of the participants were at D3 universities, and the majority of them were coming from private institutions. So I asked a lot of questions trying to assess their understanding or knowledge on just transgender individuals. One of them I did ask was how many of their students identify as transgender in the larger university that they were working for. Majority of people said unknown, like 29 said unknown or not sure. That was the majority of the responses. 8 people did give an answer or a percentage, and so that was something like I would get something like 1%, to 6 to 12, or someone just said 40. And then 13 people said 0 or none. And then 3 people did say it was not applicable. And those people were typically affiliated with a religious institution and explained why it was not applicable for their institution. So then I asked how many of your student athletes identify as transgender. The majority of people said 0 or none. The next group of people said unknown. And then 6 people said 1 to 2 athletes did identify as transgender. And of those 6 people, a few did say that they actually had helped a transgender student athlete navigate the NCAA policy and were a part of that process. So these are my procedures. I created a survey with about 30 questions, like I said. I sent it out in an email to a listserv of athletic trainers, as well as I found emails for the compliance officers and the athletic directors on their department web pages, and then created my own database. I sent a follow-up email 2 weeks later, and I used Qualitative to gather that. So for my data analysis, I used a qualitative exploratory approach, and I did that because there is little to no research on transgender athletes, and then there's even less on just policies in place to help transgender athletes participate in sports, making it really difficult to know where to even begin with this research. I used a thematic analysis because I thought themes would best represent what was actually happening, and the way I did that was I read through the responses multiple times. I highlighted things that really seemed to stick out or that seemed to kind of hint towards a certain theme, and then I collaborated with a peer who also read through them, highlighted things, and then together we came together and compared our notes and landed on these themes. Okay, so I found 4 themes in one sub-theme. The sub-theme was only represented by a small group of people. These themes were represented across all questions asked, but their answers do mean something different depending on the question. So the themes were a lack of information, in progress, the problem has been addressed or changes have been made, waiting, and the sub-theme of this is not an issue. And these 4 themes help highlight areas of growth, areas of positive change, and areas for improvement in the NCAA athletic departments and the sports world. Okay, so for the theme of lack of information, this just really displayed the lack of knowledge of the participant, or they just weren't sure of the answer. It was the most common theme found. It was represented in every question, and the most frequent responses I got across all questions were, I do not know, unknown, or not sure. And this didn't matter whether or not the question was a knowledge-based question on like what transgender student athletes might need, what would be appropriate changes to, beliefs that they might think about transgender individuals. People just would just say, I don't know. Only a few participants would explain their lack of information when asked, and some really did give a lot of detail as to why they didn't know and why they would like to know. So in progress, this theme, although represented across many questions, was most prominent in questions asking what directly was the athletic department or university doing to support transgender student athletes or transgender students in general. So I found this a lot when asking about changes, policies, or facilities. The majority of the responses did say something like, we're in progress, we're working on it. Some were really specific about what they are currently working on. But for example, a question like, has your college or university adopted policies to support transgender students, would elicit a response that would indicate that there's something that they're doing that is in progress. So for the theme of already made changes or has been addressed, again, represented across most questions, but really, again, specific about the questions where I was asking directly what they are doing or could be doing to be more inclusive or more accepting of transgender students and transgender student athletes. And in these questions, the participants would directly state what it was that they were doing, like specifically saying that they've adopted a policy, they've made physical changes to their facilities, they've implemented new trainings. So for example, one of the quotes I got was, we have a gender neutral restroom locker room in our athletic venues. When traveling overnight trips, a transgender student athlete has the option to have their own hotel room if they're more comfortable rooming alone than with a teammate. Our incoming freshmen must all go through safe training education to educate them about LGBT community and to help stop bullying and harassment. So I would get a lot of answers that would, indicate that they've already put something in place to support a transgender student athlete. So the theme of waiting basically was just represented by the fact that the answers indicated that they were not going to do anything until a transgender student athlete came forward. I got responses that said it was not a concern until a student came forward. Reasons given why they weren't going to make changes were they didn't know what would be most helpful, they didn't have enough information or knowledge to know what to do, and one person even said they wanted to treat each individual on an individual basis, so they would not make any changes till then. Some of the quotes that I did get were, we have not made any changes yet. If our conference would mandate it or the NCAA would mandate it, then we will make changes. If we had a male or female athlete making the transition, then we'd make the changes necessary. It just hasn't happened yet. We're a small Christian school. We have limited resources. Another person said, until I have a transgender athlete, I cannot tell you what does and does not help. Another quote was, there is no policy specifically addressing transgender student at our administration, has decided we should try to accommodate each transgender student on a case-by-case basis. Another person said, have not had a need. So that just indicates that they're just going to wait until someone comes forward. So not an issue was the sub-theme I found. It was only represented by a few people or institutions. Most of those people were affiliated with the religious school, and they gave answers that said things like, in biology of the person, what the school was going to use to determine gender. They said things like, not an issue, always go on biology. I did have one person who was affiliated to a religious school and said that they understood the importance of it, but it was going to be a low priority for the institution at large. One person wrote, at our university, they would be dismissed on an honor code violation, potentially indicating that some institutions would not need to implement a policy based on their institution's honor codes or rules due to their religious beliefs and affiliations. So that is why this theme exists, and it was really only represented by those who were speaking from a religious institution. Okay, so I asked a lot of questions about policy, whether or not they heard about the NCAA policy and what they knew about any policies at their university or in their athletic department. So 84% of the participants had heard about the NCAA policy directly from the NCAA. Answers varied from when a policy was implemented. While the majority of the institutions created their policy in 2015, which was 11 institutions, 4 years after the release of the handbook, 3 schools did create and had a policy in place in 2011. The researchers, I cannot provide an explanation for why, but my hypothesis is that potentially they had a transgender student athlete and were willing to make changes sooner due to their experiences of helping someone navigate the NCAA bylaws, but that is just a hypothesis. So at the time, 5 people were working on a policy for the athletic department. 3 who reported a religious affiliation said there was no policy in place. 4 people said that their athletic department just adopted the NCAA policy, and 5 discussed hoping that their institution would create a policy, and some even spoke of frustration that their institution had not had a policy in place. So this just kind of shows it in a graph form of who has a policy versus who doesn't and who's creating it. So I asked the question, what special needs do transgender athletes have? And kind of trying to get at what do they think would a transgender student athlete need to be able to participate in their sport successfully. And I got answers that fell into different categories. So people said facility changes and gave answers that represented changes to facilities that they thought would be needed. People gave answers saying that mental health and emotional support would be needed, saying things like proper medical care, possible extra counseling, access to counseling. People gave answers about acceptance, just saying we need to value people, we just need to accept people. People gave answers about guidelines, so just having guidelines in place, policies. Safe spaces and language came up, so making sure we're using the proper language, we're creating safe spaces for these athletes to be in, just having understanding, knowledge, education, and then again, I do not know was also there, and so these were the different categories that people felt would be important to address. So this slide represents the departments that did not make changes. 22 respondents indicated that no changes had been made, and their reasons were given included a lack of funds, infrastructure issues, and it not being mandated. So this first quote says, "We would like to make more changes to our facilities, but finances is an issue, so we have to be creative and work with the space we have." The second quote basically said that since it wasn't being mandated and because of the people who are in charge do not have sensitivity to this issue, it would have to be a top-down approach, saying that the conference leaders would have to really push the people in charge to do this, the athletic directors. And then the last quote just said that unless it was mandated by the conference or NCAA, they're just not going to make changes because they were a small Christian school. So this slide is about the changes made. So that was adopting the NCAA policy, creating their own policy, providing trainings or education, or making changes to their facilities. It really varied on how many changes each person listed that their university did. Some listed 1, some listed many. 6 participants had indicated that they helped a student athlete transition or navigate the NCAA bylaws, and 2 of those people listed the specific changes their athletic department made in response to having a student athlete come forward, and they listed locker rooms, education, uniforms, media coverage, emotional support, and medical advice. So this slide is just about further support and training. So 15 participants did not think that transgender student athletes needed further accommodations beyond those already made for sexual orientation, potentially suggesting a lack of knowledge on their behalf. Only 21 participants reported that they received training on gender identity, but that it was not mandatory, and many of them indicated frustration with that. And 22 explicitly stated that they had not received any education on gender identity. And most people did say having more education, information, access to others would be really helpful for them. So for my discussion, 1, I think it's awesome that the majority of the participants heard about these guidelines directly from the NCAA. They knew that they existed and they understood the importance of becoming more inclusive for transgender student athletes. It was also really awesome to see that athletic departments and the greater institutions were making changes, from adopting policies to changing their facilities. Also, the findings do suggest that the participants did have a lack of understanding about the needs of transgender student athletes, or were not really sure how they would support one. But many of them were really open and wanting more training and more education to better assist a transgender student athlete in the future. And the amount of "I do not know" answers is not surprising due to the lack of knowledge and information that currently exists. So, more to my discussion, I think moving forward, it may be helpful for the NCAA to be more involved with the institutions, potentially almost mandating certain changes to help people be more inclusive, because there's just really like a lack of not being sure what to do or what would be helpful based on the participants' answers. Again, based on the answers given, there's a large variation of what institutions were doing, so more guidance might be helpful, but also there were limitations due to a range of factors. It is discouraging that the trainings were not mandated, but it was encouraging that athletic departments did take the NCAA's recommendations of inclusivity seriously. So limitations include that most of the responses were from athletic trainers, which they would most likely be the people working closest with a transgender student athlete, but they are probably not the ones in charge of policy updating or policies for the athletic department. The sample size was fairly small because many people didn't finish answering the questions, which might have indicated a flaw with the questions being asked or the survey, or having to write in their answers. I sent it out during football season, so that's a pretty busy time for people, and a lot of the respondents were coming from the Northeast and Northwest region, so there wasn't a lot of variation in the demographics. So for future direction, I just think gathering more information about transgender athletes or student athletes is just going to be really helpful, and about their experiences, as there's just little information in general. I think continuing to address the effectiveness of policies and following up on the changes institutions have made could be really helpful to learn what was effective, what was useful, and what could have been done differently. I think working with the NCAA to provide more education and trainings to their institutions could be really helpful, either helping them learn how to mandate or just helping them provide it and get it out there, and just continuing to explore what schools need to do to be more inclusive.